Afternoon, everyone. It's 1 p.m., so it's time for us to start. My name is Yulia Ivanuk, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the university campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on the territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'm very happy to open this year's virtual lecture series with a presentation on St. Nicholas Day in Ukrainian Canadian Christmas tradition. Our presenters today are Father Dr. Roman Bozyk, who has been with St. Andrew's College since 1992 and is currently a Dean of Theology and the Principal of St. Andrew's College, and Pani Myroslava Pidhirnyj, who is a Ukrainian community leader in Manitoba. She's a cultural coordinator for the Institute Prosvita, president and board member of the League of Ukrainian Canadians, and a vice president of the board of directors of the National UCC, and a director on the board of the Manitoba branch. For longer versions of the bios can be found in the comments section for those who are interested. I also wanted to let everyone know that this presentation will be recorded and posted on our social media platforms later. After the speakers are done presenting, you'll have a chance to ask questions. Please indicate in the comments section if you'd like to be called on, or if you'd like to write down your question. I'd be more than happy to read it for our speakers to respond to. And now, without further ado, I welcome Dr. Father Roman Bozyk.
Thank you. I'm happy to actually speak first because then I can listen peacefully to Pani Myroslava's talk, and I'm looking forward to looking at the cultural aspects. But for my talk, I want to start with aspects of the church understanding of St. Nicholas, because a lot of what happens in the cultural world and folklore comes out of what's in the church. Sometimes it's unrecognizable and sometimes it's very close. So I want to sort of start with the basic things. St. Nicholas, the wonder worker and Archbishop of Myra and Laodicea, he was a bishop in Lycia, on what is now the southern coast of Turkey, the southern part of the coast of Turkey, along the in the Mediterranean. And as you'll see, he's in the town of Myra, or Mira, sometimes in Laodicea, which is why in Ukrainian he's called Mykolai Mirlikiewski. So he's bishop at the beginning of the 4th century, or some would say the change from the 3rd to the 4th century. He's born in the late 200s, in the 3rd century, and was bishop already at the beginning of the 4th century, or close to it. In a way, he's often given as a general example of what a saint is in the Orthodox Church. Why do we look at people as saints? And he's always given as a good example for one basic reason. One reason is that he was very good at what he did at the beginning with what he was given as a normal monk and bishop. He was, as a priest and then bishop, open to people. He was very good with children. He was helpful being a bishop of a seacoast. He was good with working with sailors and all kinds of difficult people who live on the sea. And also as a bishop, he was known for preaching the truth. And so he actually is often thought of in the church as having spoken at the First Ecumenical Council in 325. So he did sort of all of the normal things that bishops are supposed to do, but he did them very well using his own sort of, you might say, human abilities as was inspired by the Holy Spirit. And it was this person then that was given more and more support, more and more inspiration by God, to the point where he began to do miracles which normal people couldn't do. So when we talk about miracle working saints, they're usually not just people walking down the street that all of a sudden do miracles. They're people who show faith in God, and we are reminded of the the words of Christ in the Gospels that says, "If you're faithful in small things, you will be given greater things to do." So by being a good person, he becomes a bishop. By being a good bishop, he eventually is given wonder-working powers by God and begins to heal people rather than simply visit the sick and pray with them and do all these things everybody's supposed to do. So that's why he's one of the reasons why he's a saint. But having said that, he is the one that he's known really for three things in the church. And I'll sort of, I think, go with I'll start with sort of what I see as the three things in the church and in the order of how he's remembered in the church. One, he's known as a great bishop who spoke the truth, a strong and strong teacher. He's known to be a person who's taught theology or taught the people theologically to understand the truths about God, which puts him in the position before the First Ecumenical Council of speaking about who was Christ. That was the big question that came up in 325. Who was Christ? Was he divine? Was he simply an angel? Was he simply a man? All of that sort of thing. So from the church's point of view, he becomes what later on, much later on, say 8th or 9th centuries later, the Roman Catholics started to call doctor of the church, a teacher of the church. So he starts there because he's explaining the truth. And so this puts him into a position where when the church met in 325, this is why he's thought to be amongst the ones who were there, he was opposed directly to a person named Arius. Arius was a priest, and he was a person who did not believe in the Holy Trinity and did not believe that Jesus Christ is divine. And so he sort of ranked, rather than a Holy Trinity, he ranked the three persons as God, the one in heaven, and the Father, we would call him, and then God the Son, he simply called the teacher, or the leader, Jesus. And then after that, the Holy Spirit was some kind of created fuzzy feeling or something. It was a little bit fuzzy in his Arius's ideas, but in some ways, this Arius followed somewhat what was the general understanding of Judaism about who Christ was, and so was not really teaching the Orthodox understanding that was revealed to us in the New Testament. And so you'll see this in many prayers. He's mentioned in the Akaphis prayers. He's mentioned as a person who went to Nicaea and confessed or proclaimed the true Orthodox faith. He's taught as one who directly opposed Arius. So much so, he directly opposing. He's also mentioned in the Akaphis that he opposed Arius and also a man named Sibelius, a more obscure heretic who seemed to have confused all of the three different persons of the Trinity together. So he stands for the truth. So much so that he was always talked about as loving, kind, patient, very pastoral. And yet, when it comes to the Council of 325 held in the early church, the very first church, very first church council, he is credited with slapping Arius in the face during the sessions because it was just too much to take what he was saying. Some of the translations actually say punch, not slap. So it looks like almost a bar fight to a certain extent, but not quite. So this is how angry he was by this heretic. But he was defending the faith. So he was loved very much by this. Clearly, this is not really the trend that became popular in the church later on in the cultural things about that. He's not a bishop who punches people. Is not what we talk about every day. But the second thing he was very famous for was that he was very much concerned with the sick in the parish and the poor in the parish. and so he worked to have um, um, medical centers and that sort of thing, and prayed for the sick, and eventually was given the miraculous power of God to do healings. He was also known for supporting the poor. There's a very unknown canon in the early church, a law in the early church, that every diocese or every eparchy has to have three things. One, they have to have since I'm, as was said, the Dean of Theology, I always like to bring this one up first, and Dr. Yanuk is here too, I have to remember that. The first thing every diocese or eparchy or church has to have is its own school, its own seminary to train clergy. So that's number one in my book anyway. Number two, of course, is it has to have its own monastery, because you have to have men and women in separate monasteries praying for the whole success of the church mission. And the third thing, which sometimes is forgotten, is that the early canon said every diocese must have a common kitchen, which we would most likely call a soup kitchen and or food bank. You had to have a place where poor people could go to eat. It was funded and hopefully sponsored by the bishop. And so the bishop was to provide soup for anybody who needed it in his eparchy. So St. Nicholas was known very much for that. So when there's issues about poverty issues, when there's also issues about, because he was worried about the poor, the sick, and the healing, he also became, as was noted in many places, also a friend of the traveler, which, being a bishop at a seacoast port, a port city bishop, is clearly what he should be doing. He should be praying for travelers. I can't imagine getting on those boats from 2,000 years ago, although most people survived those trips, but still the percentage kind of worrisome. But anyway, so he becomes one of the prayers in the Kaphis, which are prayers for a saint or to a saint. They are, he's called the healer, he's also called the helper, and he's also called the pilot of those who travel. So sometimes Orthodox people, even today, when they send letters, if they hear you're traveling somewhere, they'll send you a little email saying, with the prayers of St. Nicholas, may you have a safe trip, stuff like that. But anyway, actually, the one I like the best is the one about the angels. Somebody once sent me when I was flying to Europe, may God's holy angels fly in front of the plane that you will be sitting on, which I think is a very interesting concept also. But so Saint Nicholas is known for that, for helping the poor, for dealing with issues of sickness and safety, and from safety then praying for travelers. So Orthodox and Eastern Christians were very much into having sometimes Kaphis or prayers or Molebins to St. Nicholas before long trips or whatever. I mean, they're not the only way of doing it, but very often this was seen as part of the preparation. So for us, it kind of falls, just before Christmas, traveling. So it is kind of a good time, I think, to have that type of a holiday this Saturday. That's sort of the two things. The main thing that we remember today, but what is also important, is that he was a bishop that took some of the advice from Scripture very, very seriously. And one of the things was in the prophet Ezekiel in the Old Testament. There's a seldom quoted thing about our pastoral ministry to people, and one of the things that Ezekiel, one of the things from God that came through the prophet Ezekiel was that the words which were explained over a whole chapter was that all the souls are mine, says the Lord. All the souls of the family, all the souls of the world, all the souls of the parish are equally important to God. This can be used in a number of ways, which I'm not going to get into all of them, but you can't spend all your time worrying about elderly, sick people. You have to deal with the children. You can't just always say everything about the parish deals with the children and then leave all the middle-aged people and university students without any any interest? No, everybody is important. And so one of the ways that St. Nicholas was important, but is that he did spend as bishop and as priest earlier time with children. He's known as the friend of children. Clearly, also with the concept of caring for the poor and the sick and everything else. There were lots of children in that group, but also children in general. So they were known to have access to him. He was known to make a point of talking to them, which of course is not the normal situation in many parts of the world. But he was known very well for this, to care for the welfare of children. One of the great examples, which is also mentioned in one of his in his office prayers that the church wrote about him and to him, is he granted once a dowry. Again, worrying about the poverty. One of the famous stories about his life, which some may have heard, was that as a bishop, he saw a family that was very poor. They had 3 daughters, and in those days, the parents of the daughters had to provide a dowry. This ensured a safe and good marriage, because the concept behind all of this was if there was no dowry, it meant the parents didn't consider the child to be worthy of anything, and thus she was then kind of vulnerable to all types of abuse and everything else, either inside marriage or outside of marriage in society. If there was no dowry, the husband had nothing to lose. So if he was inclined to be an abusive spouse, there was nothing anybody could do about it. Those were the days. Thankfully, they're hopefully no longer like that. But so this bishop secretly at night visited in the time of darkness and dropped 3 bags of gold coins. I don't know how many there were, but 3 bags of gold coins, one for each of the daughters, so that the parents would not have to spend their entire life worrying about these daughters, and allow them to have a proper marriage and have a chance at a decent life in the 4th century world of the Mediterranean. And so this tied him to the concept of gift giving. So people started to give gifts in the name of St. Nicholas, and so he becomes known this way. And also it became symbolic of, again, doing the best you can in the situation you are in for young people and for children. And so this is one of the things that sort of tied the 2 together quite well. And so I think it's this third aspect of the life of St. Nicholas that is the most remembered in the church now. There are places where, because he's carrying 3 bags of gold, they're kind of white, and sometimes there are icons or pictures of this, that he was seen as, they thought he was carrying bread to the poor. Now, as a good bishop, probably he was taking bread to the poor sometimes, but that's not actually the story that we hear. So most likely he was taking bread to the poor, but he was also became sort of a patron saint in some places for bakers and everything else like that. But there are others like that, so I'm not going to get into that. That's not really what he's known for. But things, as one author talked about, academic writing or patristic writing in the past, sometimes great works travel through history looking for an author to be attached to. That's also, I think, some good stories about bishops kind of float around until they find some bishop they can tie him to. So some of the stories about St. Nicholas, I think, are added on later on. But still, the strong strength of standing for the truth of the church, the help for the poor, and then the sick, and then of course the travelers, and then of course his extraordinary care for the children of his eparchy. These are the 3 things he was remembered for. He's commemorated in the churches everywhere on what is usually now called December 19th, which is either December 6th or December 19th. That's his main feast day. He's also commemorated, which shows how strong he was honored in the church. He's also commemorated on Thursdays, which is kind of odd. There's 7 days of the week. Every day of the week has a designation. And Thursday is the day of the apostles. And St. Nicholas was considered to be such a good bishop, and actually so early in the church, being born in the 3rd century. He was only 200 years behind the apostles. And so he's celebrated with the apostles on Thursday. Every time you have prayers on Thursday, St. Nicholas's name will be mentioned. And he is also commemorated by some people, not all the churches, but in May 9th or May 22nd, which is the moving of his relics from Mira to Bari in Italy. This is very controversial because some Orthodox see it as why did they get moved to Italy? And so they're actually not in favor of it. And so some don't celebrate it, but it is commemorated in some places. In Ukrainian, it's sometimes called Teplý Mykolai, the warm Nicholas, as if, but it's the holiday you can celebrate during warm weather if you want to, because Nicholas is also associated with the nativity and with winter. And so it's usually cold. But the one that is celebrated now in December, the main day for him, December 19th, it has many connotations, but it is interesting that as bishop defending the faith, he had to basically discuss who Jesus was, and thus really his speeches and what's known of his, well, not his writings, but what's known of his position at the council was the explanation of the nativity, which is kind of ironic because, as we'll hear from Pani Myroslava, after you go through centuries and centuries to get to this century, he started to be associated, rightly or wrongly, with Christmas. But that's where he started as a bishop who was explaining the theological significance of the birth of Christ, of the incarnation. Because this was not a normal birth. He had to point this out. He's not just a regular rabbi or regular philosopher or whatever. He is the Son of God. So I don't know if you have any questions you want to ask now, or should I wait till the end? I think I'm more or less done. There's always a danger with priests that they could go on and turn everything into a long sermon. But I know we're going up till 2 o'clock, so to have questions and everything, I think I'll stop now. And if you want, I can read all the quotes that I was mentioning, but I don't have to if you don't want to. So please, if you have questions now, or Yubi, I don't know if we're going to wait till after for questions.
Perhaps it would be best if we reserve the questions until later.
Absolutely.
Until after Pani Myroslava presents.
Good.
Thank you so much, Father Bozyk.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And now Pani Myroslava Pidhirnyj will talk about the cultural aspects of St. Nicholas Day. And let's unmute Pani Myroslava first.
Slava Isusu Christu. I first of all want to apologize for the technical problems that we've been experiencing. I'm speaking on my phone rather than on my laptop because it appears that my laptop camera is not working. So in any case, I was very pleased to have been asked to speak to you today about the traditions surrounding the celebration of St. Nicholas Day in terms of Ukrainian culture and how these traditions have evolved through the years and in the Ukrainian Canadian context. St. Nicholas Day is one of the most beloved and joyous of holidays. Children everywhere wait impatiently for the arrival of St. Nicholas and for the gifts he brings, and Ukrainian children are no exception. I certainly recall my own children writing to St. Nicholas to assure him of their good behavior, and then anxiously awaiting the morning of St. Nicholas Day in order to open presents that he may bring during the night. Many of us in the Ukrainian community have been busily preparing for the celebration of St. Nicholas Day. Indeed, some have already celebrated on December the 6th, if they're on the Gregorian calendar, and for others, those of us who celebrate by the Julian calendar, it's coming up in the next few days. This day unofficially marks the start of the Christmas season. It is historically devoted to gift giving, especially for children. For those who may not be aware, but as Father Bozyk has stated, St. Nicholas was an actual person who lived in a approximately the 4th century AD. He became a bishop in the city of Myra in what is present-day Turkey, and secretly gave gifts to those in need, particularly to the poor and to orphaned children. He made these gifts anonymously, not seeking any acknowledgement or notoriety, but finding joy in helping those less fortunate. Many legends, and Father Bozyk did mention one of them, have arisen about the works of St. Nicholas. The legends about his providing a dowry to a poor shopkeeper with 3 daughters to marry off and no means to attract a suitor. Legends about saving a young boy from captivity. Legends about saving poor fishermen caught in a horrific storm. Small wonder then that St. Nicholas is known as the patron saint of travelers, especially sailors, of prisoners, and of course, children. The first mention of St. Nicholas in Ukraine appears to date back to approximately the 9th century during the time of Prince Ihor, when he was depicted on a coat of arms. During the 10th and 11th centuries, with the spread of Christianity in Ukraine, tales about the generous and often wondrous deeds of St. Nicholas became more widespread. Churches were named after him. Icons of St. Nicholas the miracle worker were painted. And in the Middle Ages, the town of Mykolaiv was founded on the Dniester River. While in Western and Central Europe, during and following Reformation, the veneration of saints and icons was banned, common folk were reluctant to completely abandon their beloved saint, and so they adapted him. Adapted. In England, he became known as Father Christmas or Old Man Christmas. In France, he was Père Noël. In Germany and Austria, he became Christkind or the Christ child who brought gifts for children. While in the US, he was known as Kris Kringle, a variation of this name. The Dutch called him Sinterklaas. During the Victorian age and the revolution of the industrial revolution of the late 19th century, the concept of St. Nicholas regained popularity. But St. Nicholas began to develop a big tummy and was depicted in a variation of red and white robes and suits. But it was Clement Clark Moore, an American author and professor, who is credited with publishing the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, that became more popularly known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, and transforming St. Nicholas into the legendary, pudgy, jolly fellow known as Santa Claus. Ukraine, with its Eastern Rite churches, both Orthodox and Greek Catholic, continued to honor and celebrate St. Nicholas, however, throughout the centuries. In Ukraine, St. Nicholas has always been depicted as a distinguished Byzantine bishop, dressed in formal robes and mitre, and walking with the aid of a crozier or bishop's staff. Gift giving in Ukraine began about 2 centuries ago, with modest gifts being placed under children's pillows during the night of December the 18th. These were often small necessities such as socks, scarves, mittens, or books, and of course, sweets. Children who were naughty were often threatened that they would receive a gift of twigs if they didn't behave. Traditions varied from region to region, but often included the baking of special honey cookies called Mykolaichiki that were made of honey. The hospodar or farm owner would get up earlier than usual to tend to the animals and wish them good health so that his farm would be successful in the coming year. In some parts of Ukraine, the animals and then the entire family were sprinkled with holy water to keep them from harm. In other areas, and I don't know how this came about, but after they came home from church, the farmers would get together and cook beer. I don't know what beer has to do with St. Nicholas, but they did it on St. Nicholas Day. Another tradition that we don't know how it came into being, but is now widely accepted, is that all debts should be paid by St. Nicholas Day, and all arguments should be settled. Ukrainians generally attended church services in the morning and then feasted and visited with friends in the afternoon. Many believed that whatever the weather on St. Nicholas Day, so would be the weather throughout the winter. Despite occurring during Advent, this was a day of joy and happiness, with an emphasis being placed on spiritual values such as charity and forgiveness. With the immigration of Ukrainians to Canada and the United States, settlers brought these values and traditions with them. Early Ukrainian immigrants tended to settle in close proximity to each other and congregated largely in churches or national homes, which they built on the prairies. They brought with them not only their faith, their language and tradition, but also their indomitable Ukrainian spirit. They worked hard, largely on the soil and on railroads. They were not affluent, but they stayed true to their homeland and managed to retain the traditions of their forefathers. Following the Second World War came my parents' generation, who were on the whole more educated, very patriotic, and more urban. Settling in larger cities and towns, they joined existing parishes, schools, and community centers, commonly known as prosvitas or national homes, and created some new organizations. Though small gifts were still brought by St. Nicholas under their pillows, some of the children and grandchildren of these consecutive immigrations also attended Ukrainian schools, where the celebration of St. Nicholas Day was truly something to look forward to. Children wrote letters in advance, telling of their accomplishments during the year and promising to do better in the next one. Most parishes, Ukrainian schools, and youth organizations to this day host a concert in the honor of St. Nicholas. Children sing traditional songs, recite poems to St. Nicholas, and put on a St. Nicholas play. Finally, in anticipation of his long-awaited arrival, the children sing, "Och, to kto Mykolaya любить?" Oh, who loves Mykolai, or St. Nicholas, heralding his arrival along with his entourage of heavenly angels to express love for the children and to distribute gifts. Of course, there is also the inevitable presence of a little devil or two carrying twigs for children who may have misbehaved during the year, and all the children run away, far away from these little devils. Regretfully, this delightful celebration of St. Nicholas Day in the urban setting is quickly disappearing among the majority. With subsequent generation of Ukrainian Canadians, we see the inevitable influences of assimilation, intermarriage, and the strong effects of commercialization in North American culture. The popularization and commercialization of Santa Claus and his somewhat tenuous ties to the birth of Jesus Christ and Christmas Day have impacted not only our Ukrainian tradition, but the meaning of Christmas in general. Many have chosen to adopt the prevalent culture of their new homeland and have embraced Christmas as a time for turkey, a Christmas tree, and loads of presents. Interestingly enough, it can be argued, however, that the simple gift giving on St. Nicholas Day in the earlier Advent period in our culture actually helped preserve a Christmas Day focused on Christian spirituality and on the birth of the Christ child. For much of the 20th century, Under the Soviet regime, both the Ukrainian Orthodox and the Ukrainian Catholic churches were banned in Ukraine, as were celebrations of any Christian feast days. Yet people longed for their old traditions and were reluctant to abandon them. To fill this gap, the Soviets popularized the fabricated Russian concept of Ded Moroz, or Father Frost, and his companion, his granddaughter, Snehurочка, who brought presents under the New Year tree. This was the Soviet response to St. Nicholas, or Santa Claus. Since the renewal of independence nearly 30 years ago, there has truly been a rebirth of traditions in Ukraine. This has been particularly evident since the war in eastern Ukraine began with Russia in 2014. Numerous church, youth, and lay organizations across Ukraine have undertaken campaigns to help orphans, the children of servicemen, and children displaced by the war, as well as war veterans, by ensuring they are not forgotten at this special time of year. By following his example of generosity to those in need, especially children, St. Nicholas continues to be a model for the compassionate life. Just to give you some examples of such charitable activities, Help St. Nicholas Make a Child's Dream Come True is a charity in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, which has some 15 locations across the cities where they collect warm clothing, toys, and books for orphan children, for those in hospital, and from low-income families. Another widespread charity that donates gifts to children from St. Nicholas is the Help Us Help the Children Foundation, based in Canada. The International Ukrainian Youth Association, or SUM, has been organizing a campaign called Teplom Zihriemo Sercya, or Warming Hearts Through Kindness, since 2013. This campaign, undertaken by SUM branches across the world, annually provides gifts to some 2,000 children and orphans of those fighting on the Eastern Front and to children displaced by the war in various centers throughout Ukraine. The Ukrainian Catholic Church conducts a drive annually in Lviv to provide small gifts and homemade foodstuffs to members of the army and volunteer battalions fighting on the Eastern Front. Another campaign in Lviv is called Mykolai Pro Tebe ne Zabude, or St. Nicholas Will Not Forget You, and is targeted for poor and orphan children. Other initiatives tend to the needs of the elderly, veterans, and those in poor health, with the delivery of food parcels in various parts of Ukraine. All of these initiatives truly embrace the spirit of love, charity, and giving espoused by St. Nicholas. We in North America find ourselves today with a potpourri of traditions. Many have continued our traditional celebration of St. Nicholas Day, whether on December the 6th or December the 19th. Others have abandoned this celebration and embraced the gift-giving and Santa Claus figure associated with the Western world's Christmas, while newcomers exchange gifts left by Ded Moroz on New Year's Eve. Some have incorporated many, if not all, of the above. In short, the Ukrainian community in Canada is not homogeneous and tends to celebrate in a variety of ways. The prevalent theme, however, in all of these traditions is the desire to help and bring joy to others, particularly to children and to those less fortunate. It is a time to spend with family and to those in need, to think of others and to be truly compassionate and charitable. After all, is that not what being a good Christian is all about? Our St. Nicholas traditions just add to the joy of the season and make our giving all the more delightful. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pani Myroslava, and thank you, Father Bozyk, for your presentations. Now it's time for questions. Does anyone in the audience have questions for our speakers? You can either write them in the comment section or just let us know that you have a question and we will call on you. Dr. Tzab, yes, please.
Yeah, just a question. During COVID times, has the St. Nicholas situation changed in any way? And if so, how does she see, or how does she react to that kind of situation?
I take it you're talking to me, she? Okay, my response to that would be that in many cases, things are being done online. Certainly parents are still encouraging children to write letters to St. Nicholas, and children are expecting to receive gifts under their pillows. And all of the organizations that I mentioned and many others that I do not know about or did not mention are still gathering money, are still asking for people to donate items, and are still acting in a charitable manner and providing those who are in need with all of the basic necessities of life.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, I'll give everyone some time to think. I have a question as well. Would be very curious to hear some stories of how your family celebrated St. Nicholas and maybe also some of the other Christmas festivities. So if Father Bozyk and Pani Myroslava would like to share a little bit about that, about your memories from childhood and maybe the changes that you have seen throughout the time, that would be very interesting to hear. Thank you.
Right, maybe I could start there. You had a Christmas was an interesting place. Where I grew up in a small town in Vida, Manitoba, was probably 95% Ukrainian, either Ukrainian Catholic or Ukrainian Orthodox. So December 25th was clearly sort of a small thing in those days. It has become a bigger deal now, that's the thing. But at one time it was quite a small thing. And we all had what we called Ukrainian Christmas off from school, because if 90% of the students don't show up, nothing happens. So it was planned never to, when I landed up later on as an adult, when I became a priest in Ontario, I was actually shocked that people didn't get that day off, because the whole school and the whole town shut down for Ukrainian holidays. But it was St. Nicholas was kind of the beginning of the whole celebration, and there were some families that gave out gifts on St. Nicholas Day. There were already some by that time, because I was a kid in the 60s. There were in the 60s there were already people that were saying, yes, we should give out gifts on St. Nicholas Day, but let's wait 6 days and we'll give them out on the 25th, that we will fit in with everybody else. It was kind of interesting, because there were still some diehards that would say, no, we're going to do that and do it on Ukrainian Christmas, which of course was as Pani Myroslava would say, is a misinterpretation of the whole thing. They should have given it out on St. Nicholas Day. So some people handed out gifts on the 25th because they didn't want their children to be different than everybody else. And on the other hand, the ones who really knew what was going on, would give them out a week earlier, so it would even be better to be a member of the Eastern churches, right? So that was always a good thing. But there was always a Christmas concert, sometimes run by the church, sometimes by the school. When you have 95% Ukrainian kids, if you have a Christmas concert in the school, it's pretty much mostly Ukrainian carols anyway and everything else. So it was a St. Nicholas Day concert. We didn't have in those days arguments about winter holidays and stuff like that. But it was St. Nicholas Day was important because it was sort of the beginning of a big cycle that went all the way to the Feast of Jordan on the 19th of January. So it was a month of celebrations. half of it during Lent and half of it outside of Lent, but the whole thing sort of, was connected together, which included one of the big things, which was still very big in Manitoba, in Canada, in the 60s and 70s, was visiting homes on New Year's Day with well wishes. This was a thing children did all the time. Children were starting to go around on Halloween, but it seemed to be a very superficial holiday because all you got was candy, right? But if you went with wheat to homes on January 14th, they would give you money and cookies and everything else. So this was a great thing. So when I left and went to Ontario in the 80s and came back to visit family in the 90s, well, I was back many times, but by the time the 90s came around, that whole custom had just collapsed, which was very unfortunate. So there was a lot of that going on in the early times, and I think things have changed as as was mentioned, where it becomes some influenced by the new situation in North America, in Canada, and so sometimes when people talked about Santa Claus and everything else, it was like he's clearly Saint Nicholas, but just dressed differently. But sometimes people saw this as an absolute sort of secularized competitor that has to be completely fought against and ignored. I'm not going to tell you what side my family was on, but it was, there were these two tendencies going through the community, and one of the things that was always pointed out was that in Eastern Christian churches, he always wore bishop's robes, as was mentioned. They were always gold, usually gold, and even in the Western church, they were often Roman Catholic bishops' vestments, which were often blue. So some people said the whole thing with red vestments, red clothes for Santa Claus is because it fit in better with the Coca-Cola commercial in the 1930s or whatever. And so how much did St. Nicholas influence Santa Claus, and how much did the Coca-Cola company influence Santa Claus? So yeah, it's Santa Claus himself could really be argued is really just an advertising vehicle for Coca-Cola, but they weren't able to protect him as just their representative. So he's everywhere now. But on the other hand, it is an unfortunate kind of thing. But I even heard somebody speaking one time about St. Nicholas coming in a sleigh and stuff from the north and all this kind of stuff, and mixing the two stories all together, which I think is really too bad. If we have two different stories, at least we keep them separate. That's at least safe. That's a good thing. Yeah, I think it was St. Nicholas was always St. Nicholas Day was always looked forward to because it was the beginning of a month of holidays, really. December 19th to January 19th.
If I could just add a couple of little things. I'm from a different immigration. I came to Canada with my parents as a small child, I guess in the mid to late 50s, and we settled directly in Winnipeg. My first memories of being different, of being Ukrainian, I thought everybody was, until I went to school. And I remember I think it was either kindergarten or grade 1, being kept home during Christmas holidays. And here we're mixing Christmas with Święty Mikołaj and St. Nicholas Day and so on. But we did state that St. Nicholas sort of begins the celebration. So I'll talk about Christmas. My first memories were coming back to school after Ukrainian Christmas and being asked for a note. And I couldn't figure out why I needed a note. And the teacher said, no, you were away yesterday, so you need a note. I thought everybody was away to celebrate our Christmas. And so my parents, who couldn't write English, dictated to me, and I had to write a note for myself about why I was away on the 7th of January in order to celebrate Ukrainian Christmas. Another example of what my childhood memories were. We often got our Christmas tree on Boxing Day, because that's when other people, Canadians, threw their Christmas trees out. They put them up beginning of December, or some of them even in November. And on Boxing Day, they were standing outside already, all undressed, some with some tinsel on them. And my father, we were not affluent at that time. And well, we're not affluent now, but we certainly were not affluent at that time. And my father went out and picked up a Christmas tree that had been used already, but gently used. And we put it up then at our house before Ukrainian Christmas. Getting back to St. Nicholas, I remember distinctly how disappointed I was. I went to Ukrainian school initially on Euclid in Winnipeg. It's now Filipino Senior Center, but it used to be called the Markian Shashkevich Ridna Shkola. And I went to Ukrainian school there. I couldn't have been more, I probably was in grade 1 or 2 of Ukrainian school. And we were having a St. Nicholas Day concert, and the children came running, saying to me, hurry up, you got to see this. Your father is becoming St. Nicholas. I couldn't believe it. I ran behind the stage, and sure enough, there was my father putting on a beard and dressed in vestments, and he was going to play St. Nicholas. Well, I was extremely disappointed, because St. Nicholas was, to me, a real person, and he was the one that shared gifts with me, not any Santa Claus. For what we refer to as English Christmas, but it was Christmas on the 25th of December, we really didn't celebrate in any way. We obviously, the family was together because we had the time off from school and from work and so on, but we didn't have a turkey, we didn't have a Christmas tree, we didn't give gifts. That was, and then Ukrainian Christmas was the spiritual. We got little gifts in terms of mandarin oranges, nuts, and candies, but we didn't get big gifts. That was the spiritual time. That was the time for Sveta Večerya, Christmas Eve dinner, and going to church for, I'm of Ukrainian Catholic background, and so we went to church for a midnight service. And so those are the memories of my childhood.
Thank you, Pani Myroslava and Father Roman, for sharing your personal stories. Just final call, does anyone have any other questions for the presenters today? Oh, I can see a question that Ivan Zhovnich has asked. Some people say that it's not good to lie to children that St. Nicholas brings presents. They suggest that it would be better to tell children the truth about the source of presents. And in the future, children won't question their faith. What do you think about those opinions?
Yeah, I think sometimes it is, we have to be careful that we don't, because sometimes children will associate all of these things about Santa Claus and St. Nicholas, and then also associate them with, of course, questions of the faith, like, that Christ was born for our salvation, things like this. If they start to think they can't trust their parents, who gets the gifts, there's a point to that argument that they might start to doubt their faith. I think we have to be, of course, it's hard to give advice to parents. That's why I'm speaking first, so that Pani Myroslava can fix it after. But, I think we have to be careful how far we push this. I mean, I think children can be told that their gifts are given because people are following the example of St. Nicholas, which is different than saying St. Nicholas is traveling around at night to give gifts. But St. Nicholas did give out gifts in his life as a bishop at night and all of this. So there is that precedent. So I mean, he did show show the way that we can act and help those that are in need. I think it's partly this is a psychological question, and I think even with charity to poor people, we have to be careful not to embarrass them in front of other people. So giving this 3rd century, 4th century bishop who gives out charity at night is, I think, a good example for us to follow in some ways. That's my understanding of it.
I agree with much of that, but children are a lot more resilient and a lot more savvy than we give them credit for. And I don't think there's a lot of harm in stories of tooth fairies, in stories of Saint Nicholas. In fact, we don't have them in our culture, but certainly in North American culture, we've got the bunny rabbit that hides Easter eggs and so on. I don't think that any of that really brings any harm to the children. I think it brings some delight, some much wanted and much needed expressions of love and of charitable works. Certainly, at some point, children are of the age where they can understand better. And, whether that's at age 7 or 8 or whether that's at 10 depends on the individual child. And so then parents can explain to their children that I wouldn't use the word there isn't any Saint Nicholas, but that the gifts have been brought to emulate Saint Nicholas, that it's a way of expressing love, expressing the charity and the desire to help and assist. And I think children at that point, and parents know when is the appropriate time to tell them.
Thank you, Pani Myroslava and Father Bozyk. St. Nicholas Day certainly has a special place in all of our hearts, and we found out today about how the celebration has evolved both in Canada and in Ukraine throughout the time. And in the end of the day, it's important to remember what this holiday is really about, apart from all of the gifts and other pleasant things that we get to have. So on behalf of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies, I'd like to wish everyone a joyful and a safe Christmas season and a happy new year. And thank you for attending this lecture today, and please stay tuned for more events that are going to follow in the next year. Right now, the center has opened some new social media networks. So we are on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. Whichever network works for you, please follow us, and we'll be happy to share different news and events in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.